We are great television and more. Serving viewers in Kansas and Missouri, this is KTWU Channel 11 Topeka and K30AL Channel 30 Iowa.
This is Election 02, the governor's race. Tonight's guests are the Libertarian and Reform Party candidates Dennis Hopper and Ted Pettibone. And from the Washburn University Political Science Department, your hosts Bob Beatty and Mark Peterson.
Greetings and welcome to Election 2002, a series of special programs brought to you by KTWU. The purpose of these programs is to provide you, the viewer, with what we hope is a broader and deeper understanding of the positions of the candidates for the major offices on the ballot this November 5th. Today's program features discussions with Dennis Hopper, the Libertarian Party candidate for governor, and Ted Pettibone, the Reform Party candidate for governor. I'm Bob Beatty, your co-host, and I'm joined by Mark Peterson. We are both faculty members of the Political Science Department of Washburn University. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Well, thank you very much. It's nice to be here.
I'd like to start with a straightforward question. Why do you want to be governor of Kansas?
I think the state is in serious trouble. I think that nationally, our economy is getting ready to take a nosedive, and I would like to try to cushion my state from the ravages that I think is going to affect the country at large and Kansas in particular. So I'd like to do what I can, and it's really late in the game, to try to get us on some sort of reasonable fiscal basis, because the way it's going now, we're headed for bankruptcy. And it isn't going to change unless something changes. I'd like to change it.
You've not gathered a lot of media attention during your campaign. One of the things I did was a sort of a LexisNexis search before in preparing for this interview. Why do you think that's the case? What's the problem with getting the message to the media?
Well, the media is basically bought and paid for by the same people that has bought and paid for the legislature and the political process here in Kansas. The media isn't interested in reporting new ways of dealing with the problems that the state faces. And as a matter of fact, they, with the exception of one radio station, they have pretty effectively shut Mr. Pettibone and myself out of all coverage, not just any coverage. We may get one line in a full-page production about the Republicans and Democrats. Mm-hmm. So they're doing it on purpose.
Well, in the one story that I did come across, which was in the Topeka Capital Journal, you made the observation that if you were fortunate enough to win, you would try to cut state government by 30% in your first term in office. How would you go about doing that?
We have a really good guideline for doing that. If you look back to 1980, well, we just look back to 1990. And if we went back to what I think was the overblown, sloppy, fat government of 1990 in the state of Kansas, that would give you a guideline for cutting our government by 30%, because under Bill Graves, public spending has increased, state spending has increased by 30% in the last 8 years. Mm-hmm. I'm in favor of, I don't believe you can downsize what we got. I really believe we need to start over within constitutional guidelines for establishing what the government's going to do and what it can't do, because that's what the Constitution is for. It isn't necessarily saying what the government can't do. It says what it can do. And if it goes outside of those guidelines, it's unlawful, and it gets to be the monster that we have today. It's taking 50% of your salary.
Mm-hmm. What should the government do, in your opinion?
I think it should stop people from affecting each other's rights. I think that the government should stop fraud, force, and should look to the public welfare in those areas that the Constitution allows, which is, building roads. When it comes to the government doing what it's doing now, which is having its finger in every aspect of our lives, from SRS saying that they can take a child out of a home because the kitchen's dirty, to the DOT saying that we're going to make a road from point A to point B, whether you like it or not, and whether we need it or not, despite what the people really want. When government gets too powerful and too big, it gets abusive at the same time, and I'm tired of it. And I think that most Kansans are pretty tired of it too.
Part of course, government is that it's not just the governor, it's a legislature and it's the courts. I'm curious to know if the Libertarian Party has a program to actually run enough people to win legislative seats and become a force in the legislative branch as well.
Right now, we're running people for 80% of the seats in the Kansas legislature. We're running a candidate for senator. We're running candidates for Congress, although not in the 2nd district, but in other districts. And we are the largest third party in the nation. And we intend to make ourselves heard. I think, unfortunately, people are not going to listen until the state and the country are totally bankrupt, which is happening. And, the federal government's printing more money than it's ever printed in the history of the country. The dollar's going to go the way of the peso. And if we can keep government from becoming a police state, which is what the Republicans and Democrats are setting up right now with internal security, which is always a prescription for tyranny. If we can stop the government from becoming a police state and tracking us constantly, then perhaps people will be able to listen to the Libertarians. Quite frankly, I expect this to be the last election in the history of the United States where I can actually criticize an incumbent, if there was one, which there isn't in this race. But with federal legislation that has been passed, although it hasn't been decided whether it's constitutional or not, with the federal legislation passed, I don't think that the incumbents are going to allow challengers to criticize their records. And I think that's what McCain is up to in his campaign, quote, finance, but really it's campaign control. But we don't really have time to go into that.
You mentioned a police state. So are you arguing that some of the new proposals concerning anti-terrorism are just contributing to what we would call a police state?
Don't you think? I do. Yes. I'm extremely concerned. My main thrust, and the main thrust of the Libertarians, is something that you very seldom hear the Republicans or Democrats even mention. Freedom. I find that everything that the government sticks its fingers into is poorly handled, too much money spent on it, and I find that government programs generally are counterproductive and even have unexpected consequences that are frightening in the effects it has on our constitutional rights. The war on drugs, perfect example. I'm a lawyer, and I represent criminal clients, or criminal defendants, and if you get a 19-year-old kid who's pulled over, and he happens to be black, or Hispanic, or maybe have an earring, the cops are going to try to search the car. Please step out of the car. You don't mind if we search, do you? And the kids are usually intimidated, and if they aren't properly intimidated, the police will intimidate them, and they usually are coerced into allowing a search. So I think it's happening.
And you don't see protections like the exclusionary rule being worth anything in that sort of an environment. You're not able to get that kind of thing thrown out when you defend them in court.
Totally depends on the judge. Certain jurisdictions here in Kansas, one of which I practice in a lot, which is Jefferson County, our judge there respects the Constitution. Other judges have looked me in the eye and said, Mr. Hoffer, get on with your motion. I don't want to talk to you about the Constitution, which raises my blood pressure. And sometimes I get a little feisty with him, because if he doesn't want to talk about the Constitution, what about the oath that he took?
Well, it seems from what you're suggesting that it's to ask substantive questions about things like how you would change the administration of public education or SRS or something.
No, I'd be glad to talk about public education. Let's talk about public education.
Okay.
I'm a product of public education, but I'm a product of public education before 1965, because I graduated from this university in 1965. Right now, I represent children who are accused of crimes, and I read their, quote, confessions, and these kids can't spell. They can't write. They have no math skills. So what we're getting here, people are saying, oh, we need to give more money to education. Isn't that a standard campaign flag that people are waving? More money for education?
Sure.
Well, what's happening here is education in the United States and in Kansas is failing. And therefore, we are rewarding public education for its failure by giving it more money to continue to fail with. I believe that we should, if a kid's going to graduate from first grade, I think he should be able to pass a first grade curriculum test. He should be able to spell whatever. I'm not an educator, and I'm sure that our PhD educators that are paid $100,000 a year for overseeing our school system should be able to figure out what a first grader should know.
I'm sorry, we have about a minute and a half, and I want to make sure you get in what you want to get across.
Yeah.
And if it's something different, I want you to be able to say it.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I'm asking the people of Kansas to vote for me because I will deliver common sense, everyday common sense, to the governor's office. I'm not, I haven't gotten a nickel of campaign money from any vested interests, and I wouldn't accept it anyway. If the people of Kansas want somebody who will straighten out the educational system and leave tax dollars in their pocket so they can do with them as they wish, instead of having some bureaucrat in Topeka decide how this money is going to be spent, then they should vote for me. If they want to continue to elect the people that got us into this mess, then they ought to elect the Republicans and the Democrats. But they better start taking care of themselves, because when this economic whirlwind hits, and it's going to hit, the government is not going to help you. So we'd better be self-reliant in Kansas, because you really have no choice.
Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it. We'll take a short break and be back with Ted Pettibone of the Reform Party.
To make good business decisions, you need the facts. I'm Susie Garrow.
And I'm Paul Kangas. At Nightly Business Report, our top concern is getting the facts right about the financial markets, corporate development, and the global economy.
So when you need the facts,
depend on NBR.
Tonight on KTWU.
Welcome back to Election 2002, the governor's race. In the first half of the show, we talked to Dennis Hoffer from the Libertarian Party, and we're now happy to have Ted Pettibone, the candidate for governor of Kansas from the Reform Party. It's nice to have you here.
Thank you, Bob.
I'd like to start with a straightforward question. Why do you want to be governor of Kansas?
I looked back in the last legislative session, and I saw some things that I didn't agree with. I saw some behavior that I didn't think was really becoming of public servants in terms of the infighting. That got me interested, and I started to look back in time at specifically the finances of Kansas, back through, let's say, 1990. And I felt as if we could do a better job. And rather than sit back and complain, I decided to do something about it. And here I am.
Most people are concerned about the budget problems in Kansas. On your website, you say that, quote, by taking outside-the-box actions, spending can be brought in line with taxpayer receipts to balance the budget. So I have a two-part question. Are there serious budget problems in Kansas, and what outside-the-box actions would you do to solve them?
Very good question. I do believe there is a very critical budget problem in Kansas. In 1998, we went through a tax reduction. I think it was around $250 million. And ever since, we have been deficit spending in the state of Kansas. And as of the year 2002, I think it was March 22nd, the last I calculated, we had deficit spent to the tune of $750 million. And that just happened to be what we had on hand at the end of 1998 when we felt like we could cut our taxes. We didn't do anything about the checkbook. And so as we cut taxes, which I think was a good move, to help make Kansas more attractive to business and people that want to live here, we didn't take any actions on the spending. Now, I think when you look at the spending, there are a couple things. We're hearing a lot right now about blue ribbon panels. Well, a blue ribbon panel, what I'm used to calling those is seagull management. You come in, you land, you squawk a lot, you get everybody nervous, and then you leave. What happens after? And I think that's really the key. It's been said that we haven't had a top-to-bottom review for 10 years in Kansas. Well, we're not going to do another top-to-bottom review, do nothing about it, not have one for another 10 years. I believe thinking outside the box is we need to put in place a very aggressive cost control process. And under my governorship, this would be a group that would be funded out of the cost savings which they would accrue. Monies would be pulled from all budgets on a pro rata share to pay for this group. And they would go in and work with agency heads, department heads, and everybody can create a laundry list of things that we can do to save money. The problem is can they get it done and implemented? And that's what this group would do. And they would be accountable to the governor directly, the governor's cabinet, the key legislative leaders, and potentially even the media, because I want the people of Kansas to know that we're taking this seriously. And this would be on a monthly basis, and there would be accountabilities for this group. And I've seen this, and I've managed this in private business, and it is a phenomenal way to get people involved in the process. You don't dig a well when you're thirsty. And we're trying to dig a well right now, and we're pretty darn thirsty. This process has to be ongoing, and it can't stop. And we should be able to pull $150 to $200 million, or at least avoid increasing spending or cut spending by $150 to $200 million a year once this process gets underway, which quite frankly could take 12 months to get the pipeline full of projects and actually get some of those projects being completed, so we're actually realizing the savings. Another thing, thinking outside the box, which really would be what we need to do long term, and I'm very much in favor of this, is a constitutional amendment in Kansas, a tax and expenditure limitation amendment, if you will. And I would like to see this limit government growth year over year to inflation minus a reasonably acceptable measure for productivity. And there are 26 states that have these measures that they've enacted since 1976, I think was the first one, in New Jersey. They're all in varying degrees of effectiveness, but I think the two states that really stand out is Washington and Colorado. And Colorado ended 2002, and all we saw were endless budgets in every direction at the state level. They ended with a balanced budget, and they also did something pretty nice for their taxpayers. They returned over $900 million to their taxpayers. And I think that I don't want to get away from representative government, But I think what you want to do in terms of the finances is give them a degree of freedom that you're willing to let them control. And then when they want to step outside of that, which would be going above the limit, you literally want it to go to the voters. And that's what they do in Colorado. If the state recommends spending more than that limit, then it has to go on referendum to the voters. And after receiving a few rebate checks for a few years, it's very hard to get them to consider a tax increase. And I think that would help Kansas all around.
On that point, one of the difficulties that a candidate like you has, and I think of the illustration of Jesse Ventura up in Minnesota, who was a Reform Party candidate when he was elected, is that you've got a legislature to deal with, and that legislature is going to be controlled by an established political party that doesn't have a lot of appetite for giving coup points to the opposition. How do you see your governorship working with the legislature?
Well, I think that we have a unique situation here in Kansas. I think there's a lot of inner tension amongst the legislators. We've got the Democrats, and then we have the two wings of the Republican Party. And that's one of the things that I saw during the last legislative session that was disappointing. We all need to take off our party hats, and we need to say, look, Kansas is in a hole. And as Rumsfeld said today, when you're in a hole, the first thing you should do is stop digging. Let's take our party hats off, and let's think of what is right for Kansas long term. And I think a third party is really well positioned right now to come in and do that. They're not really giving up anything to the other party. The third party, the Reform Party in Kansas, in realistic terms, over the foreseeable future, is never going to be a force. So there's not that threat there. And I think that as my career has evolved through business, one of my strong points is that I'm a very outcome-oriented person, but I also can work across a lot of departmental lines to collaborate, to form bonds, to get things done. And I try to have something in there that keeps everybody sort of interested. I'm not going to make everybody happy, and I'm not going to try to do that. I believe you make everybody unhappy if you take that approach. But I think it's really more of a collaborative effort. But I think I'm in a unique position. Now, with regards to Jesse Ventura, he was a Navy SEAL. I respect him for that. I respect him for his movie career. I like a couple of his movies. But did he really have the skills to be governor? I believe I do. I have a good, strong educational background, and I have a very good business background that has been, a trend of success after success after success in many different industries. So I think I bring something more to the table. I think I'm a serious candidate for governor.
Do you have a long-term plan for the Reform Party? Is one of your goals to build it into a viable third party in Kansas?
Well, one of the things that I see in politics across the whole country is that we are locked into the Democrats and the Republicans. And, they've earned their position in that political process. But I think that new ideas, look at John McCain. He is kind of a rogue out there on the outside, but he brings in these ideas like campaign finance reform. He may be running on a third party for president here in the next election. I think that's the role that these third parties can play, is that we can come in and, because we're not professional politicians, we haven't accepted millions of dollars of contributions from the private interest groups. We can say things that that the major parties can't, and I think that really has some value and can get the voters thinking. And if we don't win the election, Gus Hall, head of the Communist Party back in the 20s, they always used to say, why do you run a presidential candidate every 4 years? You're never going to win. He said, it doesn't matter. We want them to adopt some of our ideas into their platform. And I'm not a communist. I'm not promoting communism. But in terms of just an example, I think we have some good ideas, and I hope that some of those, if I don't win the governorship, are imparted on to Tim and Kathleen, because I think it would be good for the long-term benefit of Kansas.
Let me change the topic a little bit. Education is the 800-pound gorilla in the state budget, and the two traditional party candidates have made a lot of mileage out of talking about what they would do. In your website, once again, you make reference to a very clear focus on the 3 R's, and doing something that you refer to as employing foundation technologies. What are those foundation technologies? What are you talking about?
Well, this really goes back to a statement that Milton Friedman made a couple years ago. He actually is the father of school vouchers. He came up with this idea back in the 50s, and that it would create more competition and improve the public school educational experience. But he said, what endeavor, what industry do you know of today, what profession do you know of today that hasn't been radically changed in terms of what it used to do 200 years ago because of technology? Mm-hmm. And I look at education, and although we are using some computers as tools, how are we using this technology to really get more out of the educational experience for the student? Now, thinking outside the box, and you think of sort of the ultimate goal of where you would wish to be, why do all students in each class have to go through 12 years of schooling? Why don't they go through 10, 9, 8? Think of how much resources that would free up. Think of the time that it would offer students between when they completed 12th grade and when they entered the workforce or entered college to really go out and find out what it is they want to do in life. I think all of us agree the first year when you were in college, you thought you wanted to do something, and by the time you got done, you may have been doing what you thought you were interested in. Probably not. I know I didn't. But if we can use technology to help children advance in those areas where they have special skills, rather than put them through the same rote curriculum and progress, I think that we're going to get all students that are able to achieve more given their specific skills. And so foundation technology, computer-based learning in conjunction with a teacher moderating, I think is something that we should try to move towards. And quite frankly, I think that the issues with rural education and the challenges that they're facing in terms of finance, I think that remote learning through webcasting and computer-based learning is going to ultimately be the solution. And I want, the Kansas Board of Education, to start looking at those areas to see if we can relieve some of those problems.
Well, believe it or not, we're out of time. It went quick. Thank you for coming.
Okay.
And thank you for joining us for this, the third in a series of programs dedicated to the notion that an informed electorate makes wise choices. We sincerely hope you'll be making your wise choice on November 5th. Goodbye.